I send greetings this morning and want to thank God for the opportunity to be here. I want to thank Pastor Redwine and all the associates for the hospitality and extending the opportunity to come before you this morning. It's truly a privilege, and I consider it a grateful opportunity to be here with you this morning. I want to thank all the members of the church, of the covenant, for your support during the lectures where we had earlier, and your attendance today. And certainly to Mr. and Mrs. Redwine, thank you for your encouragement, your support, and for all that you do. For all visitors and friends, it is great to see you this morning, and we believe that there is a word from the Lord. I'll read the second half of the scripture taken from Genesis 21, beginning at verse 1 to verse 7. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. And when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." May the Lord add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the doing of his word. Also this time I want to thank my wife and my two daughters who always make us laugh for being here in attendance and support this morning. And so for today's subject, as you see printed in the bulletin, the Lord gave me the topic, who's laughing now? Who's laughing now? And part of the subject makes me think about what laughter means and what laughter is. And I reflect about a year ago, during this time in our nation, maybe a few months later, there was a lot of excitement and euphoria. In some quarters, a lot of laughter. Some laughter, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, was of one particular type. Other types of laughter was of another type. And certainly we can distinguish between the laughter of children, that joyful, jubilant laughter that fills our hearts and spirits to no end. There's also the laughter of mocking and the laughter of other kinds that seems to put us in a place of concern. Well, fast forward about a year later, those who might have been laughing before are no longer really laughing now. There are many who in our nation are wondering, how could the laughs and the jokes along the way that occurred turn so terribly wrong? But if we're to answer that question and try to understand, as we understand the text with Sarah, how laughter can quickly turn into lament, I think this text helps us to understand how we in our day are making sense of and wrestling with this laughter, like Sarah had laughter, not joyful and jubilant, but a laughter of pain and concern. But how God can take that laughter of pain and concern that looks back over years and days and decades and centuries of concern and turn it into a type of joy that is full and wholesome. And so that's what we hope for today. When you think about the different types of laughter, you think of laughter that includes parodies. You think about satire. You think about slapstick comedy. You think about the absurd and the kind that's nonsensical. You think about even dark humor. But you also think about irony. And I think what's found here in this text and also in our own moment in time is a little bit of all of these, but there's also irony. But mixed with irony and some of the other concerned satire that we see on shows like Saturday Night Live and other shows, we also have sarcasm. And some begin to wonder, as Minister and Reverend Lowry talked about with the wonder of children, we begin to wonder, as Sarah began to wonder, is a cruel joke being played on us? And why has the laughter that is so innocent and beautiful and pure turned into something that is so distressing and concerning? But maybe if we are to understand this, we can understand the laughter that may find itself in different ways in different places in our culture. For instance, laughter from the African American tradition can, as Mel Watkins says when he talks about, on the real side, the African American humor of the underground tradition of that transforms American culture from slavery to Richard Pryor, where he talks about how in the African American experience, humor and laughter, I think Toni Morrison was quoted as saying, is not necessarily funny, but how people find some way to make sense of the travail and the difficulty and the challenge of life in order to find some level of joy. Because when we think about laughter, we have to think about the context in which one is laughing. And if we think about the context in which one is laughing, we can determine whether or not people are laughing with us, for us, or at us. And sometimes no one likes to be the subject of laughter that is not necessarily for you. It can turn into ridicule and it can turn to smallness, where you can feel small and feel as if someone is picking on you. And so maybe that's what Sarah might have been feeling as she listened in on the conversation. Maybe she was feeling perhaps that there was this long sense of concern that no one else had thought about, that the biblical writers had written with a lens that had not considered the condition and the challenge of women in Scripture. And so if we were to take Sarah's words and ask her what she meant by her laughter, maybe she would tell us a story that might help us to better understand that her laughter was deeper than most people could understand. Because the Scripture seems to kind of gloss over the laughter and kind of project the laughter as something that is insignificant. But oftentimes, as even with a silence or a moan or a groan in the African American tradition or in the tradition of those marginalized, there is more that is said than meets the eye. And so I want to suggest that in Sarah's laughter, there is joy. In Sarah's laughter, as some writers will say, there was resistance. In Sarah's laughter, there was something that seemed to challenge the condition of women at that time, that allowed them to be tokens and positions of men, but never to hold positions of that in society. And so here was Sarah, who had been used and utilized in the ways that Abraham had determined, as with Abimelech and also with Pharaoh. And oftentimes we know that Sarah was an equal partner with Abraham. Still somehow one begins to wonder how far that equality went. And so in our society, we begin to wonder about how far the equality goes. And when people are laughing about certain things, we wonder if there are double standards, not only in society, but also in the laughter in which people evoke. When some people say certain things, why do some seem to get looked down upon negatively and others get patted on the back? Why do some, in some cases, get applauded for certain types of laughter that may be strange or cowardly, and others are accused and looked down upon? And one example I give you when we talk about laughter, we think about the example of Bill Cosby. We think about in our society at this particular time, in the 1980s, the man who was known as America's dad, who brought people to highest heights of laughter. Over the same course of time and even before that, found himself in very, very difficult and challenging and frustrating circumstances. But if we think about his situation, we also have to think about the women who have come forth. And we have to ask the question, is everybody lying? Can we just dismiss everybody out of hand as saying that what they are saying is not true. But at the same time, as we see the public trial of Bill Cosby taking place, there is another occasion that causes us to wonder about the role of laughter in our society. While Bill Cosby is undergoing a trial, there is another situation in our nation that for some stoked much laughter and ridicule and cajole over the last season, and has evoked much satire and parody again on SNL. But for many people, it does not provide a laughing matter. For those folk who are looking for how they're going to pay the next bill, it's not a laughing matter. For people who are trying to figure out how they're going to pay for health care, whether they have black lung from the coal mines or have a debilitating condition, and while some folk have keg parties on the lawn of Congress, it is not a laughing matter. And it seems strange that in one particular case, we can have one amount of justice, but in another case, we can continue to be confounded and be controlled by a laughter that is not funny. And so how do we understand this? Well, we understand this when we look into the African American tradition as it relates to laughter. And it helps us to understand the position of women in society in biblical times and now. And it helps us to understand in many ways what Du Bois called double consciousness, that some folk don't have the luxury of either or, that perhaps Sarah was not just laughing out of one particular place in her spirit, but maybe she was laughing out of many places. Maybe she was laughing because she thought it folly, she thought it strange, but maybe also she was laughing, asking the question, do you know what I've had to go through? Do you know what I've had to experience over the course of my life over these many years? Do you know what I, by custom and tradition, had to do, was forced to do, believing that that was the only way that I could provide a son for my husband, to find the slave girl and to have her to go and have a child for him. And then after that, I had to deal with the emotions and the feelings and the mixture of sensibilities about feeling displaced because of that. And then so after all of that, I come to this point, and at my age, upwards in age of 80 or 90, here you come, God, telling me that now I'm going to have a son. That along the line of the tradition, along the lines of jealousy and bitterness and backstabbing and backbiting, which we find in our culture, after all of that, the treachery and all the things that have happened over the course of the journey, just like those during Juneteenth, I'm asking the question, if I'm Sarah, why did it take so long? And why didn't you ask me this question or tell me or inform me this before? Let me just pause there real quick and begin to soon come to a close at some particular point. And since hopefully being a Baptist preacher hopefully won't have people up walking out of the room before long, but I'll try to get to a close. In the Baptist church, we always say when we're saying we're closing, that means about 5, 10, 20 minutes later. But today, we will respect the house we're in. But I have a theory. Sarah was not overhearing. Some folks said that Sarah was overhearing. No, this woman, this sister, was eavesdropping. She intentionally knew where to be, where to position herself, where to go, and what to listen for. And so it was not an accident, and it was not a surprise for her to hear. We just don't get the language and the rhetoric of what she said. But you don't have to hear the language and rhetoric of what she said. You can imagine what she might have been saying in your imagination, in your spiritual imagination. And it may be in many ways, to me, she wasn't quite dealing with Du Bois's double consciousness. She may have been dealing with a duality, trying to figure out how she could be a sister to Abraham, which is why he was able to navigate his trajectory and use her, even though they weren't brother and sister in the traditional sense. Yes, things were complicated. So he was his sister, half-sister, but at the same time, he was his wife. He was his partner. And they had somewhat of an equal relationship, you might say, but it was complicated. But it was equal, more equal perhaps than that of Celia the slave, who, being the second wife of Robert Newsom, did not have any type of parity and any type of equality, equanimity in their relationship. And so when we think about why Juneteenth comes forth, we think about the enslaved women like Harriet Jacobs, who had to sit up in a tree and watch her child day by day, but never mention a word, never utter a whisper, because if she uttered a whisper, she would be discovered, and she had to determine the difference and make the decision, would she make a sound and try to have a moment face to face, or risk not seeing her child again by being sold into slavery? And so what a choice to make in a very difficult space and set of circumstances. But such was the position of some women. But here is Sarah eavesdropping. Here is Sarah listening in. And I'm sure Sarah was not surprised, but Sarah seemed to invoke what a lot of scholars and feminist scholars and womanist scholars call the culture of dissemblance. It was more than just either or. I am of this nationality and I am a woman. It was the fact that she was dealing with circumstances and stereotypes of a society that she had to wrestle with. And she tried to find a creative way in, and that's what happened with her and Hagar, a creative way to turn those things into her favor, to be able to make things easier, because while doing that and fulfilling her duties, she also had to deal with the pain and the travail of not having a son. And it makes me think of the whole challenge of sons and daughters. And there's an irony and is an interesting flip to the script to why now I think God is making us laugh. Because for so long, the heirs to most inheritance were males and men. But when you look all around today, and we are living proof, it seems like a girl's world. If James Brown were around today, he would have to remake the song that he wrote, It's a Man's World, because it's no longer It's a Man's World. Of every race and nationality, and here is witness before you, there are girls being born all over the world. There are girls' causes that are being raised from one corner of the globe to the next. And so the past trials and travails and ways of ignoring women and girls in society cannot last. And so while people were laughing because they had power and privilege and could control situations, they're not laughing anymore. And although the recent election in our country seems to give us a pause for cause, that people could say unimaginable things before the presence of children. They could say unspeakable things about distinguished women in office. They could act in ways that are uncouth and unruly, but still attain the highest offices of the land. That's concerning, but I want to give pause and say that in Sarah's laughter, there is hope. Because everything comes to a particular time and season. And while some may be laughing now at some particular point, that time of laughter for some will transform. And those who were the subject of the laughter, of the ridicule, of the parody, of the satire, will become the ones who are able to make the laughter their master. And so here it is with Gwendolyn Poe talking about the act of dissemblance, to where you're able to transform the things that were used against you in your favor. And it's like what MHP says when she says the act of dissemblance was a tactic to find the upright in the crooked room. The crooked room, she says, is the reality that the public perception of black women is so distorted that many black women align themselves with stereotypes with the understanding that the room is straight when they know it is crooked. And so imagine here you are, Sarah, trying to act as if the room is straight when you know it is crooked. But you are then being expected to conform and to act in a particular kind of way. And it doesn't necessarily work well. And for a contemporary example, I'll give the example of Afeni Shakur. We know about Tupac Shakur because he has achieved fame and notoriety. We know about the movie that now is out in theaters everywhere, where people are running from here and there of all races and colors and creeds to go see the mystery and the intrigue around this figure. But before we go and run too far, we have to, like with understanding the teacher, if we're to understand the student, we must understand the mother if we're also to understand the son. Because in Langston Hughes' famous and epic poem, his mother says to this son, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. And so we have to understand that the challenges of women in our society, even on Father's Day, are real and ever present. But you could never have an Abraham who was the father of the nation if you didn't have Sarah, who was also the mother of the nation. And so how else could Abraham do all that he did without Sarah being there? How else could Tupac Shakur become one of the legendary figures without his mama Afeni inspiring him? In fact, Tupac was quoted as saying it was his mama, in the vernacular, that moved him and guided him and influenced him. And so if we are to get a word for that, we must understand Tupac's song, Dear Mama. And while we deal with the betrayal and the challenge of his demise and some of the other circumstances surrounding his very controversial career, there are aspects of his life that we need to look at that stem from his mother's courage and strength and wisdom that give us hope in this moment. And so when we look at that, we begin to also understand that laughter sometimes has a different role to play in certain societies. Among the oppressed, laughter can be deconstruction of the oppressive consciousness. Whereas enslaved people tried to convince enslaved folk that they were deserving of their condition. They could not read oftentimes, but they could offer up a laugh. And the laughs could be so secret and so symbolic that you couldn't get inside of a laugh to unpack or interpret it. And so people enfleshed freedom, as M. Sean Copeland says, within their laughter that enabled them to go on yet another day. Laughter was grace. Laughter was an alternative consciousness in a difficult circumstance. Laughter was the hope in the face of evil. And so I can imagine what womanist writers say, that's what Sarah is evoking here. That while we hear of her being fearful, in many ways, her laughter shows that Sarah had some courage and that Sarah refused to bow down exclusively to the situation and found laughter as a form of speech that would allow for her to retain some respect and some dignity. But also laughter was the transcendence of fear. You know how it is, the saying is, we have to laugh to keep from crying. That oftentimes most folk can't understand why people would laugh at certain situations when they have gone through so much. It's not that people don't understand what they've been through, but they have creatively found a way to be able to retain dignity and hope and inspiration while also navigating these difficult circumstances. And that's what Sarah was doing when she was dealing with the intersectionality of her experience. She was a woman, she was of a particular class and status, but also she was a mother at some particular point in time. And so she was trying to navigate all of those roles. And when God came in the form, anthropomorphic form of an angel, and then came and spoke, he might have been speaking at Abraham, but he was speaking to Sarah. And so today, not just on Father's Day, but every day, when there is laughter, perhaps we need to listen. Perhaps that we need to listen and hear what the laughter is saying. Because the other side also of laughter is lying. And there's another part in these last 5 minutes I have before I sit down that we have to think about. There was a recent article in the National Geographic that talked about the science of laughter, which raises the question of why did Sarah laugh? And what was Sarah's laughter consisting of? And this article talks about that there are different types of liars, just like there are different types of laughter. That there's the art of the forger, someone who lies for self-aggrandizement, to puff themselves up. I don't know about anyone who might laugh like that today. Maybe you do. There's the champ who laughs for fun, in a desire to become a superhero. This particular one person they describe tried to use laughter to convince people that they were a superhero. There's laughter of the impersonator, that someone who lies for personal gain. You know, it's the person, Frank Abagnale Jr., who was played by Leonardo DiCaprio in the 2002 movie Catch Me If You Can, who played different roles and tried to convince different people that he was any particular person at any particular time. And then there are other kinds of laughter, con artists and card sharks and pranksters and fabulous. You know, you remember Jason Blair, the New York Times writer, who was caught forging an article and was fired. Well, this Blair went from being, as he said, someone where my world went from one in which I covered the deception of others to being the one doing the deception. and eventually searching for answers to questions about why I lied and why others do so as well. And it's interesting here, Blair going through this moment of public humiliation. But somehow or another, this lamentable moment for him was eventually turned into a search whereby he, strangely enough, would find out one of the very things he would do. So what does that say to us today? Sometimes it says that, as Nikki Giovanni says in Ego Trippin', sometimes even my errors are correct. So that even though we err and we say and do things, God still has a way of bringing laughter into any situation. And so here this morning, if you are lamenting about some small thing or large thing, I was lamenting about a lot of things this morning just trying to get out of the house. And a sigh, that's another sermon for another day. The sermon of the sigh. Know that from the lament, and there is a lot to lament in our society, that ultimately, in the fullness of time, God can bring laughter out of your lament. And so I'll end with a word to Ralph Ellison, who wrote the enigmatic novel Juneteenth. Ralph Ellison was a major figure in American life. Ralph Ellison wrote one of the most quintessential novels ever to be penned, The Invisible Man, where somewhat self-autobiographically and having to navigate different ideas and ideologies in American society, from nationalism to integrationism to everything else in between, he came up with the genius of creating a prototypical figure that could morph into everybody at the same time in different stages. Ralph Ellison, after writing this great novel and people wondered with anticipation, what will the next one be like? They had wondered, but they had to wait because it took time. It took 40 years for Ralph Ellison to bring this novel about. And Ralph Ellison actually didn't live to see this novel be penned. He died before the novel was created. But he left about 2,000 pages of paper around for one of his editors and close friend and longtime executive of his estate to be able to fumble through and pin together. So even though he had to wait so long he couldn't even see it, Ralph Ellison has given us a novel that helps us to better understand the reason why we celebrate this day. That in Galveston, Texas, they waited days after the announcement of the end of the Civil War. Imagine if a party has been going on and you are the only one who doesn't know that it's happening. That you are free but yet still operating under the conditions of bondage. That's what Sarah did. That's what many of us are doing today. But still, even though they went through that, the folk in Galveston did not let that delay and that wait deny them from being able to celebrate. And that's what we have to do today, to be able to celebrate life whenever God brings us whatever God has promised us. Because no matter how long you wait, it doesn't mean that God loves you any less. Sometimes waiting is preparation. Sometimes waiting has another purpose to it to help somebody else through a particular circumstance. But in God's plan and perfect will, if we just wait and wait with a little bit of laughter, God will make us laugh and God will bring us to the place that He prepared for us. One last thing to say. About a couple years ago, we were going to a church in this particular city. And my youngest daughter and my wife were not with me. Oh, let me just say, this will make you laugh, I hope. And I was excited because the particular preacher I was going to hear that day was a preacher of renowned status. I had just seen them in another city with this same daughter, who we had the opportunity to meet him face to face. So I knew she knew what to do and how to do it. We'd had the conversations many times over about how to act and how to conduct yourself. And so we had rehearsed that many times over. And we get to the church. Oh, and this is a particular church. We get to the church and I am in the middle of worship and praise and I'm in the middle of service. I've already placed her downstairs. I have carried out my fatherly duties. I've done everything to the T, and crossed the I's and dotted the T's. And as I have my hands up and I'm worshiping God, I feel a tap on my back. And I'm wondering what's happening. God, is that you right now? Is it time for me to go prematurely? But no, I opened my eyes and then I saw that someone was motioning to me out to the side. And so I go out to the side and we go out to the back. And then we go all the way down the stairs. And then we go to the room where the children are, and immediately my laughter becomes a cause for lament. And so we get down there and I see then my oldest daughter with this forlorn look on her face. This look that seems to show that she knows that I'm not pleased about what has happened. And I get the explanation and I find out that this daughter, who knows how to act and knows what to do, has had a very terrible accident downstairs. I won't describe the kind of accident because it might concern you, but this wasn't the first time. You know, see, Sarah's not the only one who deals with things. We had another accident in Chicago when we were at a service at St. Sabina Catholic Church. And this particular same daughter had an accident while sitting near her father. And some of you who've had young children understand the travails and challenges of being a father and understand what type of accident I mean. The type of accident that does not ever give a warning. And so I'm taken back to that moment and I'm here now. And I'm grateful for the people who have gone through and helped her and given her some pants that are about 5-6 sizes too big, but nevertheless, they made much out of little. And so I'm happy that everything was taken and put together and all, but I'm delirious. I'm out of my head. I'm in not just wonderment, but amazement and bewilderment. And I go on at that time and I begin to think, God, what are you doing? This is not funny. I'm not laughing. But another year or so later, a few years later, I came to understand that sometimes what God is doing is very symbolic, because this particular church that I'm talking about, and I won't name any names, but this particular church was one that stood with those who was silent about those who said and did many bad things against people in our nation. And I began to wonder, God, what are you trying to tell me about this situation of lament, whereby I started out with laughter? And so one of the things I think that I began to understand is that God can bless our mess. And so there was a mess that my daughter created there. There were folk who helped to clean it up. And certainly in our nation now, we are in a mess. It's Father's Day. And happy Father's Day to all the fathers and as all the mothers out there as well. And as I said many times before, on Mother's Day, I know we won't have the same courtesy because Mother's Day is exclusively for mothers. But on Father's Day, we'll share the plate. But the thing is, how in the world can we go from that situation to something of a fulfillment of a promise? Well, I just want to encourage everyone to continue to find joy in laughter. Because even though in the most difficult and dark situations, God has a way of making laughter our boat to help us to get across and navigate the rivers that are treacherous and difficult. So in closing, I encourage everyone, no matter what is happening today, no matter what is going on, to laugh. And when you ask the question, who's laughing now? Imagine a day when those who are impoverished can laugh because their bellies are full. When you're asking the question, who's laughing now? Imagine when those, particularly women who are locked out of positions of leadership and opportunity, can have the opportunities that they have been prepared and destined to. When you're asking who's laughing now, ask the question of those who have been the victims of racial and ethnic and religious persecution, can finally say that this day the time has come when we can rejoice together that these days are behind us and we can laugh fully and wholeheartedly about the joy of being in this moment. Today, I encourage you to laugh. Thank you.